Thank you very much. And actually, to discuss these two papers, we have Julia Coronado, which not only is the president of the founder of the Macro Policy Perspective, but she's also a member of the Economic Advisory Group of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So thank you.
Yes,
Julia.
thank you. Thank you. All right, great. So first, I want to thank the organizers of the conference. It was both an honor and a pleasure to read and discuss these papers, both of which use an innovative data set compiled by the New York Fed, rigorously digging into the micro data to examine sort of the issues that Olivia laid out at the beginning. And I really learned a lot and commend the authors. It was wonderful to read your papers. So the way I'm going to do this is, I've transitioned over the last, over my career from being a micro foundations to macro person to just being a macro person. And so what I'm going to start by doing is laying out kind of the stylized facts of the issues that Olivia laid out and the issues tackled in these papers from a macro perspective. Then I'm going to summarize the findings, which I'll do very briefly because you just heard the findings. And then I'm going to go through some of the things I learned, the insights I gained from these papers, which did surprise me in a number of ways. So let me embark on this. Okay, so I took what the Brown et al. Paper did and just took the flow of funds data and looked at real debt per capita, real household debt per capita over a very long horizon. The vertical lines in my charts are going to be, these papers either start in 2000 or 2003, depending on the data availability. And so I put a vertical line in sort of where the analyses start, but I include a broader history so we get the sort of fuller sweep. And so you can see that real household debt per US resident stands at 43,730 at the end of 2018. It's grown 40% since 2000, 17% since 2003, and it's roughly doubled since 1989. So we have had a really large increase in real household debt per capita. Now, I remember back in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, when some of the people I see in this room and I were at the Federal Reserve Board wondering whether maybe this increase in debt was a positive development because it reflected better technology, cheaper credit scoring, unlocking the ability of younger households, relieving liquidity constraints for them to borrow, to buy homes, borrow against their human capital, and that was a good thing. And then, of course, we went through the financial crisis, and that was unambiguously a bad thing. So I think that, so this is kind of where are we now? We overdid it. There was a boom and a bust. What role is debt playing now on the household balance sheet? Okay, so we want to think about, also the balance sheet perspective. So what are people borrowing against? They're borrowing against their incomes. They're borrowing against their assets. So this chart also shows household net worth as a percent of disposable income. That's the blue line. That's sort of a standard conditioning variable in any macro forecasting model. We think there's a wealth effect. If you gain wealth, you're going to spend a little. If you lose wealth, you're going to lose a little. And it's just the household net worth snapshot in the aggregate, okay? Aggregate, not at the micro level, which is what the authors do so well, but this is the aggregate picture. So what you see in net worth is actually a lot of that borrowing is against asset appreciation, and we actually just reached record net worth last year and gave some of it back in Q4. But there's really no indications on the net worth side that there's any trouble here, that this is just assets are appreciating, households are borrowing against those appreciated assets. On balance, they're much better off, okay? That's the aggregate picture. What's interesting here too, and again, from a macroeconomist standpoint, but I think also from a financial vulnerability standpoint, we've gone from decades where household net worth kind of ebbed and flowed within a relatively narrow range to these booms and busts in household net worth. And that's an interesting thing to contemplate in terms of thinking about vulnerabilities and what we predict and what we prescribe households to do with regard to debt and asset accumulation. The green line is household debt as a percent of disposable income. And likewise, that in general, you can see that households were borrowing more than their income, so debt to income was rising. So it wasn't just in line with income growth. Really what we're seeing is borrowing that was fueled by asset appreciation rather than income appreciation. Okay, so that's another interesting perspective to keep in mind when thinking about the elderly. Household debt to income has been rising. It, of course, soared during the lead up to the financial crisis. It's been declining and is still declining. This is one of the things that I find most interesting in terms of understanding where we are in the macro economy is actually households are still pretty cautious. They're still deleveraging on an income basis. And I think I now understand a little bit more why from reading these papers, and I'll get into this. So overall picture here is this debt growth is fueled by asset appreciation, first and foremost. This is the debt service burden, so the household financial obligations ratio, the share of household income devoted to servicing debt. And this presents a very sanguine picture. Low interest rates mean that households, the cost of servicing their debt is as low as it's been since the 1980s, even though they're servicing 3 times the amount of debt. Okay, so you've got one, asset appreciation that's facilitating this boom in borrowing, but 2, you've got low interest rates that are facilitating this boom in borrowing and allowing households. So yes, debt to income has risen quite a bit, but actually the cost of servicing that debt as a share of income, near all-time lows. So certainly no cause for concern in the aggregate here. So what about bankruptcy, signs of micro distress or household distress, bankruptcies and serious delinquencies? So the number of consumers with new bankruptcies is the blue line. You can see the spike in 2005 ahead of the bankruptcy reform. There was that opportunistic spike and then decline. Then there was, of course, a rise during the financial crisis. And since the financial crisis, and of course, this is just the absolute number of bankruptcies, so it is declining. So certainly as a share of the population, it's declining even more. So really, bankruptcies we're not seeing signs of distress relative to prior periods in the number of bankruptcies. They're declining. And similarly, the 90-day plus delinquency rate, which is severe delinquencies, spiked during the financial crisis and has been falling since then. So again, no real signs of distress in either bankruptcies or delinquencies. So as a macroeconomist, I'm looking at a pretty sanguine picture of high net worth, low debt service burdens, low delinquency and bankruptcy rates. So things look pretty good. So what's the big deal? So what did the authors find? So the Brown et al. Paper finds that nearly the entire increase in debt over the past 2 decades has been among older households, particularly wealthy households aged 70 and above, and that they're leveraging mainly against their real estate with no associated increase in delinquencies or default. So lucky them, right? I mean, hey, great to be 70 with a big appreciated house, and you can borrow. And to me, that one of the more significant, and this is where I had some aha moments from your paper, younger households aged 35 and under, have not increased their borrowing at all since 2003. That is shocking, actually, against this trend. And they've shifted from mortgage debt to student loan debt, which is horrifying, okay? And so then the other paper, using the same administrative data, Lee and White find that the higher proportion of older households and bankruptcy filings. To me, I came away from this paper looking at it's not a disproportionate increase in the elderly. Mainly, this is a population story to me. That was what I came away with looking through that paper, that mainly the rise in share of elderly bankruptcy and total bankruptcies reflects a greater share in the population. The other results aren't that significant, and so there isn't a sign of disproportionate distress amongst the elderly, and those two things go together, actually. The elderly are doing pretty good. They're doing the lucky guys and gals who realized all the appreciation in real estate and 401ks and are borrowing against it, and with no sign of distress. With the exception, of course, of a few people at the lower end, older households that have taken on student loan debt. You did find some signs of distress there, and that's concerning. So this goes into, this dovetails with another finding, which is that wealth is increasingly concentrated. And this is research that came out of the Federal Reserve Board that blew my mind, and I can't get it out of my head. So this is research from the SCF that looked at changes in household net worth, and Karen Dinan has also done work along these lines, and she may be about to talk about it, so I hope I'm not, okay, good. So this is the change in wealth since the Great Recession, from the Great Recession to 2010, and then the Great Recession to 2016. That's the most recent SCF. And it looks at it by income quintiles. And what you can see is only the top 10% of households have more than recovered the losses in wealth since the Great Recession. This is an astonishingly depressing result that most households, well, yeah, they're more cautious and they're continuing to save and deleverage because actually they're still digging out of the hole. And only the very top end of the wealth distribution are doing better, realizing all the gains of the appreciation in housing. So what I'm learning from this analysis is that there's not just a income distribution, there's a generational distribution here that is disturbing. And the changing composition of debt for the younger households, the left side from the same New York Fed data looks at the delinquencies across the types of debt. And you can see that mortgage delinquencies have are the lowest and are at very normal levels. Credit cards have higher delinquencies. Student loans have the highest delinquencies. So if we're looking for signs of financial distress, look for the households aged 35 and under. They've got more student loan debt than they've ever had, and they have higher delinquencies on that student loan debt. They're drowning in it, okay? So, and I know you've also done work looking at the relationship with home ownership and student loan debt. And so you can see here, households 35 and under, relative to the start of the analysis in these papers, which was 2000, 2003, is way, way down. Okay, households under 35, it's recovered a little bit in the last few years, but you've got a generation that is finding it harder to access that road to higher net worth. So debt allows you to buy a house, which allows you to accumulate net worth for most households in the middle of the distribution, which is who we care about generally, not the people for whom there's lots of social insurance or lots of wealth, but the people who are really responsible for providing their own retirement security. These younger households don't have the traditional avenue. They've got student loan debt, they can't buy homes, and that's a problem. Also, just looking at poverty, the percent of the population below the poverty level, 65 and over, 18 to 64. There's clearly a business cycle component to poverty rates, but we've got more than 11% of the prime age population living in poverty. It looks to be on an upward trend relative to the start of these analyses. So if we're looking for signs of economic distress, again, there are signs not among the elderly, but amongst younger households. So in changes in debt and are leading to changes in behavior. So this is the green line here is adult children, 25 to 34 years old, living at home, which is still rising. It's not a cyclical phenomenon. This is still on the rise. So there's more intergenerational households, partly because it's economic necessity. And the women's median age of first marriage is getting later and later. The birth rate is getting lower and lower. The economic hardship of the younger generation is translating into outcomes that are meaningful at a macroeconomic level when I think about growth potential and household formation, and all of these issues are it is meaningful what is happening on the intergenerational level here. And if we're thinking in the future, who's most vulnerable to, yes, I'm on my conclusion slide. So changes in debt, and so this is important research. I think this is really important research because it suggests that actually the elderly are in pretty good shape. So the current retirees are not who we need to focus on when we're focusing on retirement security. We need to think about the next generation and their access and avenues to wealth accumulation, let alone the ability to take on debt. The other thing that I thought about sort of from a systemic risk perspective, and we're going to be hearing from Sheila Bair, we've improved the safety and soundness of the banking system, but we've exacerbated inequality. So banks are very reasonably tilting their lending towards wealthy older households, and they're making money off of it. They're very profitable, so that's really cool. But the younger generation is the bearing the brunt of that adjustment. So something to think about for us in terms of thinking about systemic risk. So there's just, what I took from this research was a lot of, wow, now I know why my millennial employees and students are so angry all the time. And that's all I have. Thank you.